Hello everyone, welcome to Cloud World. On today's video, we are going to be doing a follow-up into the EKS topic. On the last video, we created a cluster from scratch and we used all the basic resources from the AWS console to do so. So we created the cluster, we set up the networking, we created the node roles and also the console roles that were required for our cluster to operate successfully. In order to do that, we use the Terraform scripts that we are seeing on screen. For today's video, we are making a bunch of changes into those, especially because we are integrating a ACR, which is going to be the repository where we are going to be storing a custom image that we would like to deploy to the EKS cluster. If you remember, for the previous video, we deployed a sample application for a public image. So what we are going to be doing today is that we are going to be creating this ACR. We are going to be pushing a custom image, which is part of the solution that you are seeing on the screen right now. And we are going to deploy that application into EKS. But we are not going to make it that simple. In order to make it pretty fun, we are going to be using ArgoCD to deploy our application. So we are going to do all of those things. We are going to install ArgoCD in our cluster. We are going to take a sneak peek into it. We are going to push the final image into the EKS and into ACR. And after that, we will deploy the sample application into our EKS cluster. From there, we are going to expose everything through our public API or a public DNS in this case, so you can see the application in action. So this is going to be a very fun video, so stay with me. Let's get started. Okay, so the first step, of course, it will be to update our infrastructure into the AWS console using Terraform. I already did that. In case that you are following from the previous video, make sure that you do the Terraform apply as well with the latest changes. That way you will be able to get the changes from the ACR and some minor configuration that I did in order to be able to connect the EKS and the ACR repositories. It's actually something pretty simple. Also, for today's demo, we are going to be using a public ACR, so that means we are not going to be needing to set up a job or a role into the AWS console in order to connect to it. Just to keep it pretty simple. So let's start with step number 1, where we are going to be deploying everything related to ArgoCD. So then after we can deploy our application into the EKS cluster using ArgoCD too. Now that we are in the console, let's try to create everything. So remember, if you need to set up your AKS cluster into the console, make sure that you use the AWS AKS update kubeconfig in order to get that command. So let's take a quick refresher into that. So for that, you only need to have the AWS CLI installed, and you will need to provide the update config method as part of the AKS instruction. From here, you need to set up the region in case that you didn't throughout the initial AWS config, and also to provide the name of your cluster. After you do that, you will get the answer back that your context has been updated. Remember, this is actually pretty important to do so you can interact with the EKS cluster throughout the kubectl tooling. So now, let's start with the part with ArgoCD. So the first thing that we need to do, it will be to create an namespace in order to attach everything related to ArgoCD. So ArgoCD is actually going to be a very important tool into the Kubernetes ecosystem. Let me explain why. ArgoCD is actually a way to streamline and make your deployments pretty easily. You can connect ArgoCD as an example to your private repositories or your Git repositories, and you will be able to scan those changes that you have into your repositories into your EKS cluster. So as an example, if a developer makes a commit to the master branch into one particular GitHub commit, ArgoCD will be able to track down the application that you have deployed into the EKS cluster today and the latest commit that you have in your GitHub repository. If there is a difference between those two, ArgoCD will be able automatically to detect the change between those two. Once it detects the changes, you will be able to do a couple of things. You will be able to sync up your application that is deployed with the latest version from GitHub manually, or you can even set up the syncing to be fully automatically. So that means every time a developer makes a commit into the GitHub branch, the changes will be deployed into the EKS cluster. Whatever flavor you choose to do is actually going to depend on the business requirements, so choose wisely based on the requirement that you need to do. In a very common scenario, most of the companies allow the full CI/CD automation to go straight to the development and the QA environments. But maybe when we are going to the production environment, there is a manual interaction maybe from a CLI or maybe a DevOps engineer, which is going to deploy the application to those environments as needed. But well, most companies also could have a huge trust in the development process and everything, so maybe they would like to have everything fully automated from the beginning to the end. So let's get started with the first step, which is actually to create the namespace. So for that, once more, we are going to be using the kubectl, and we are going to be using the create command namespace and ArgoCD. This namespace is going to be the core of everything that is related to ArgoCD, because even if we are using ArgoCD to deploy our applications into the EKS cluster, ArgoCD is another deployment inside the cluster. So that deployment and that service that is going to be living inside in your cluster is going to handle the lifecycle of all the other applications in all the other namespaces throughout the clusters. So in order to deploy the ArgoCD, there is actually a very straightforward configuration. You need to do an apply into the ArgoCD namespace, and in here you will need to provide a file. The file is actually available throughout the GitHub repository for ArgoCD. So that means this is going to streamline a most basic configuration. It is going to create the secrets, it's going to create the config maps, it's going to create the deployments and the service into the EKS cluster in order to be able to operate successfully. In case that you want to create something pretty custom, like as an example, try to set up some networking rules, or maybe use a different namespace than the one that we already created, because you can do that. Make sure to clone the same repository or the same URL that you are seeing throughout the console right now, and make those changes manually and apply those changes from your local environment or maybe another repository. In the meantime, for the sake of this example, we are going to be using the most basic one that is hosted in GitHub. Good. After a few seconds, because it doesn't take too long, it's going to create everything that I mentioned before. So as you can see on screen, it's going to deploy the metric server, it's going to deploy all the changes required to create the ArgoCD controller and everything related to the server itself. A couple of config maps and several other things that are required as part of the ArgoCD infrastructure in order to work to do so. So now that we have created all the infrastructure, what we need to do is actually to set up the current namespace to be the ArgoCD. So that means everything that we are going to be doing after that is going to be executed against the ArgoCD namespace. So we are going to do that. Okay, so now our context is targeting the namespace ArgoCD. So the first thing that we need to do is we are going to be adding the ArgoCD and ARN of our cluster in our local machine. So ArgoCD is not only an application that you can deploy into the EKS cluster, but it's actually a CLI. You can go directly to the ArgoCD documentation. I'm going to drop you the link in the description below, so you can install the CLI from ArgoCD on your local environment. Pretty simple to install in your Windows machine, MacOS machine, or Linux machine. Nothing too complicated. So for that, let's obtain the ARN of our cluster. So for that, we are going to be using again the AWS CLI, the EKS command, and we are going to use the describe cluster. In this case, what we are interested in to obtain it will be the cluster ARN. Okay, I already have the value in here. So the reason that we need to do that is because we are going to be using the ArgoCD command, and in this case we are going to be using the cluster R, and we need to provide the ARN in here. So let's do that. It's going to ask if we actually want to set up everything. Let's say yes. Okay, we are ready in this case. So now what we need to do, it will be to expose our ArgoCD service throughout the internet. As it is right now with the initial configuration, ArgoCD is exposed as a private deployment and a service into the EKS cluster. That means it is only accessible throughout the cluster or making a port forwarding. For the sake of this example, let's create a service that is going to be exposed throughout the internet, and you will be able to authenticate throughout the portal as well. So let's do that. In order to do that, we are going to patch the ArgoCD server and the namespace ArgoCD, and we are going to be changing the type of the service to be a load balancer. When you expose a service as a load balancer in a cloud provider, this is going to be assigned a public IP, and it's going to go through as a load balancer as the context says. So this DNS is going to target the request to the EKS cluster, and it's going to load balance the request inside the pods that are taking the traffic for this particular service. So now the changes are ready. So let's see the services that we have already in here. So as you can see, we already have our DNS ready to use. So if we take this URL and we go straight into the browser, we will be able to see it. So let's go in here, let's copy paste it. Maybe the first time you will get an error because it's going to be HTTP, at least for this basic configuration, and it might take a couple of seconds to get the first load. So let's give it a moment and we will be back when it's ready. Okay, finally after a couple of seconds we will be able to see the ArgoCD layer. In here, the first thing that you will encounter will be the login board. In here, for the first configuration, the username is going to be admin. Of course, as part of the initial configuration, you will need to obtain an initial password. So let's go back into the console. So for that, we have the ArgoCD admin initial password. This is going to give us the initial password that is created as part of the kubectl configuration that I showed you previously. Remembering here, for a good practice, make sure to use the ArgoCD account update -password to change this default password to a more secure one that is not actually a default one. For the sake of this demo, that it's okay. So let's go back into the portal. Let's take the URL that I just created. And as you can see, we don't have any application in here. The ArgoCD console is going to display all the applications that we deploy to our EKS cluster. Of course, as I said, we don't have anything in here. So let's move into the next step, where we are going to be pushing an image to the ACR. We are going to sending that into the authentication layer, and from there we are going to be creating a new application based on the GitHub repository from the code that we have in the Git repository already. So in order to do that, the next thing that we need to do is go back into the terminal, and we need to use the AWS ACR public get login password command, provide the region, and also we are going to ask this authentication that we are going to be requesting is going to be used as part of the stdout to do a Docker login using the AWS user and using the output as part of the password. So this is what it's going to do. It's going to connect to the ACR using the AWS, and it's going to generate a JW token. That token is going to be used to authenticate locally using Docker. So that way, Docker will be able to communicate with the AWS CRR and push and pull any images as required. So just click enter. This is actually pretty straightforward. The login should be successful. So now let's go back into the other tab and let's try something. In here we are going to have a Docker image that is already filled in. It's part of the repository that I showed you before. It's just a sample web application. In here, let's do a Docker build. This is going to build the image, of course, the image as it is. We are going to give it initially a basic tag. But what we need to do, it will be to tag our image after it's being built to have a proper name that actually matches the ACR. So remember, when you are pushing an image to a particular private repository like Docker, Azure Kubernetes Registry, Container Registry, or maybe the Elastic Kubernetes Registry in AWS, which is this case, you need to match the name of the repository and also to provide a right image to do so. So while this time finishes to compile, let's go back into the browser and we can take a sneak peek. This is the ACR that we are going to be creating by default, and it's going to be located throughout this URI. This is going to be the unique ID identifier that we are going to be given, and the name that we give to the ACR and the application that we are going to store. So far, we don't have anything in here because we haven't pushed anything yet. So let's go back into the console. So now that our image has been built, let's retag it. So what we are going to do is that we are going to retag our image using the URI that we just saw in the ACR using the apps folder, and we are going to be using the latest tag for the image that we are going to be creating here. The tag is mostly automatically, so from here all that we need to do will be to do a Docker push in order to push our image to the ACR. This is going to take a couple of seconds. This image is actually pretty small, so this is going to be a very fast process. So let's go back into the browser for a moment to see how it goes. Now if we refresh in here, we will be able to see our image in here. So it is ready, it has been created just a few moments ago. So this is a good step to move on. So now let's go into the final step where we are going to be deploying our application using the CLI to ArgoCD. Now the first thing that we need to do, it will be to authenticate using the CLI. So in here we are going to be using the ArgoCD login using the core parameter. In this case, we can rely to the core request because we already added the ARN of our cluster locally, and there is already an authentication schema set up between the kubectl and also the AWS console. If you wanted to set up an external cluster, you can use the ArgoCD login and provide the HTTPS API client for your cluster and provide the admin and password for your authentication on your ArgoCD terminal. So in here, since we already have everything, we can use the core login just to get everything. Now what we need to do will be to create the application. So let's take a look. In order to achieve that, we are going to be using ArgoCD, the command app, and create. We are going to provide a name for our application, and we are going to be using a repo to deploy our application. If you take a look, what I'm going to provide here is the source of the Git repository. So this will be the root of the repository itself. From there, I'm going to tell ArgoCD to take the configuration that is located inside the Git repository under the web application inside the deployment folder. If we go back a sneak peek into the deployment folder, we will see that I already have everything in place in here to create our application. So I already have the deployment, the namespace, and also the service created in here. Everything should be ready to go once our application has been created. So now, after we provide the path, we can provide the destiny, which is, in this case is going to be the namespace cloud world. So everything that is located on the deployment infrastructure that you saw is going to create the namespace, the deployment, and the service for it. So let's apply those changes. It is important to mention that when you create an application, you are only making, like, let's call it the initial setup. The application is not being deployed by default. Let's take a look into the browser. So as you can see, we already have our application in here, but you can see a couple of things. It says that the application is missing, and it also is out of sync. So this means that the application is not deployed in the cluster itself, and also it is out of sync compared to what we have in GitHub. In here we have a couple of options. I just can go in here into the portal and click the sync button, and this is going to deploy the application automatically to the cluster. Now let's sync our applications. You can see a very quick example. So when we sync the application, we are going to be given a couple of options in case you want to replace your application, make a hard delete, you want to force the change in case you want to skip a couple of validation, or you actually want to do a full replacement. Since this is the first deployment, it doesn't make too much change to that. But if you go into the definition of your application, you will see we already have a couple of things in here. We have a namespace created, we have a service created, and a deployment that has been created. The deployment also created the replica set, and the replica set created the amount of pods that we requested, which was actually worth 3. Now the service is also available. We have endpoint slices attached to it, so we can access the application. If you click into the service, you will be given a new URL. So let's take this one up, go back into the browser. And remember, since we are working, let's say, in a development perspective environment, this is not going to be signed throughout a SSL certificate or something similar. Maybe the first time you will see this error, that it's okay because your application is being set up internally and is going to be ready to take traffic. So let's give it a couple of minutes until it gets online. Okay, so after a few minutes, when the AWS makes the initial configuration for the infrastructure, the load balancer, and everything, you will be able to see that our application is here offline and ready to take traffic. So this is one of the great things of using ArgoCD. So let's take a look. Since we already have our application and it's healthy and it's synced and everything is ready to go, we have our application live in here. One of the good things is that you can have as many applications that you would like to have. So if you have multiple web applications, you have multiple services, you have different types of things that you would like to handle, because this is not only for expose services to the internet, but also to internal applications like web services, web jobs that you would like to execute, mostly managing any type of deployment into the Kubernetes infrastructure. This comes pretty handy. So from here you will be able to handle everything. If I take a look into here, everything is on place and fully synced, so we can know. So if for some particular reason our application have like a faulty health check or something that is not working as expected, you will be able to see also this in here, because you not only will be able to handle your infrastructure deployments in your application, but also you will be able to know how your applications are behaving, because it's going to take a look into health check, it's going to make sure that the application is responding as expected, and all the criteria that you defined throughout the YAML is actually being met. Also, you can not only manage that, but also you can delete them. So let's suppose that I want to delete this one just for the sake of the demo. Once I delete this application, it's going to take care of everything. It's going to delete the namespace, the networking rules, the deployment, the services, the load balancer, and everything that was created for us. So this will take us a couple of seconds, but if we go to the application, it's going to be very likely that once I refresh this application, it's going to be down in a moment. So now the ArgoCD is still in deleting the application, so this might take a couple of seconds, so let's wait. Now that the process has been completed, you can see we don't have any more applications in here. Our application is down. It's not accessible anymore. Good. So as you can see, deploying application with ArgoCD is actually pretty simple. So in this video, you learn how to deploy pretty easily an image to the ACR, how to deploy ArgoCD to EKS cluster in a beginner configuration, and to deploy an initial application into it. Sometimes things sound more complicated than actually are, but as you can see, this is actually pretty easy to do. And you will be actually surprised, but ArgoCD is actually a tool that is favored for a lot of companies to manage their infrastructure and their code deployments to their Kubernetes cluster. So I hope you like this video. See you in the next one.